Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted, the podcast available on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, or as a full video here on YouTube. Today I'd like to present a potentially unpopular case, but one which I think is interesting to consider, which is why vintage style watches are the future. Now most watches, particularly luxury watches, I think we can all agree are fundamentally irrelevant to daily life. Of course they serve to tell us the time, but to be totally honest, it's looking at your wrist which matters far more, drinking in the edges, the curves, the finishes, the lines, knowing about the movement that's at the heart of the watch, or simply enjoying the aesthetic on the wrist. In recent years, vintage style watches have become the de facto way for brands to sell more watches and excite enthusiasts. You only need to look at a few models which have been released very recently, from the new Omega Seamaster Professional to watches from Hanhart, Seiko, the Aquastar Deep Star, Doxa, Tudor's last decade of success, and you'll find that there are vintage style watches at the core of all of these. But with more and more watches produced of this style, is it possible that new designs will cease to take the spotlight entirely? Should we accept that, whether specifically intended to look like old watches or simply drawing on former designs, new watches should have a hint of that old school style which has been created over the last century? So in this podcast, I'd like to explore just what all of this means and why I believe that we should celebrate these vintage designs as perhaps more important than new looks to the future of watches, the future of watch design, and also fundamental to the way in which we go about buying a new watch in the 21st century. Before I continue, please do consider liking, sharing and subscribing on YouTube, or following us on whichever podcast player you enjoy using in order to catch any future podcasts, as well as heading over to watchchronicler.com to read our articles and to find the full set of Watch Chronicler Unscripted podcasts with various interesting guests over the past year or so. I think to answer the question which this podcast poses, you have to ask what draws us to buy a new watch. Now, putting aside the basic interest in watches, once you've got past that and you're actually looking to buy a particular watch, there are plenty of things which could direct you. It may be technical innovation, and maybe this is the case given that technical innovation can excite one when you see something new and impressive. But then again, what is innovation if there isn't really any context in which to admire it? That's to say that is watchmaking simply a game of top trumps? Is the watch with the better specifications always going to be the one you buy? And I think it's fairly clear that that's not the case. Is it value? Well, I'd argue that almost certainly it isn't. You buy a toaster or a kettle or maybe even a car because of value, but a watch which isn't really a necessity? Well, no, because a swatch offers better value fundamentally. Of course, value might lead you to buy one watch over another in the same area, but I don't think it'll influence the original impetus to go and buy that particular kind of watch, whether it's a dive watch or a pilot's watch or a dress watch. Really, it's something else which is guiding you. Well, I reckon that it's ultimately emotion. Just look at how aggravated people become when you mention Daniel Wellington or Movement. Sure, these are fairly low quality watches with, more importantly, a nonsense message of quality and tradition in their adverts. But then again, spurious claims are very well seated in every industry, and I think we ought to accept them. Of course, you can find a lot of support for the idea that emotion is paramount in these sorts of situations, and plenty have argued that emotion is even more important than this. If you consider David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, who considered whether reason guided emotion or vice versa. On this point, in Prospect magazine, Julian Baggini put the situation rather well, I think, with the following words: "Pure reason is motivationally inert." Now, I'm no philosopher beyond afternoons discussing the point with my grandfather, but I would be very much inclined to agree with that attitude. When you walk into a watch dealer's showroom, you choose between watches by price and specifications, of course, but fundamentally, if there's something you want, that is the piece which appeals to you. But then, if we've accepted that emotion plays a very strong role in buying a watch, what makes us emotionally desire a watch? Well, of course this will vary from piece to piece, but I'll use a few examples to give you some ideas, certainly in my position, and please do let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Now, it could simply be that a watch is staggeringly beautiful in your eyes. This is what led me to enjoy my Direnzo DRZ02. Sure, it's a car-inspired watch, but it's also simply beautiful from the case lines to the dial execution. In fact, there's pretty much nothing I would change about that watch. There are also watches where the origins are exciting. Take my Grand Seiko SBGM221. The prospect of having such a Japanese watch was of interest. Its movement isn't the last generation, and isn't the iconically impressive spring drive, but as a package it worked for me in conjunction with my enjoyment of the idea of its origins. Instead of particular complication, this watch has a relatively utilitarian design of movement, brought to a very high finish, and with the best finished case, dial and hands I've ever witnessed at this price. Believe it or not, the finishing was, even under a macro lens, pretty much equal to a £70,000 Lange. Sure, not everything is completely handmade, as is the case with the Lange, but it is just as good in some ways. Really, when you consider Japan's rise from the depths of the Second World War into an industrial superpower, the idea of something mass-produced to a shockingly high standard by real craftsmen is perfectly apt, but I digress, although certainly this is relevant to my enjoyment of the watch. The point is, there are semi-exceptions which prove the rule. As with most watches, the money we spend serves to anchor our illusory musings and feelings to a solid object which we can wear and admire. For each watch, the exact nature of this illusory desire will be different. You may want the brand names of Rolex or Patek Philippe to give you a boost, or perhaps the unique and unapproached quality of a Seiko will float your boat, or sink your submarine as the case may be. But more often than not, and it must be said increasingly so in a world where internet purchases don't always allow one to try before a purchase, such desire-creating aspects are heavily rooted in history. This of course isn't even a concept rooted to watches. Take a Ferrari. These are cars which to an enthusiast often receive real love and praise as a continuation of the brand's history, its racing history as well, and of course Enzo Ferrari's very particular and rather fiery temperament. This can also be applied to any unnecessary luxury from clothing to cigars or anything else. History gives flavour and approval to a product and reminds you why you want it. Interestingly, this historical aspect may be the ultimate equaliser for brands of wildly different levels. Omega may be a true giant of the watch world, yet their claim to fame for the moon landing, which is a claim far more easily professed to the average buyer than some convoluted tale of quality in the 50s or 60s, I have to admit, is ultimately no more evocative to a particular buyer than looking at a Doxa for its use by Jacques Cousteau. In this way, both products at perhaps very different prices are equal in the eyes of their particular and respective buyers. This also means that brands with different quality levels, as a result of very different price ranges, can both be appealing to a buyer who is able to buy either of them. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the root of why I don't, after a lot of reflection based on my own buying habits, have any problem with the future being ruled by vintage-inspired watches. But to fully articulate this point, one has to take into account one final aspect, which is the era in which we currently live. One key proviso, however, does need to be noted before moving on. This predisposition to trust a product which, on paper at least, has the approval of a historic figure or body, does seem to have the potential to limit the appeal of a much newer product. Take, for example, FORMEX. This brand, which appeared just before the turn of the 21st century, is fairly well known at this point for its high-tech solutions to old-school watchmaking. Their most recent releases are also extremely promising, but if you simply cling to vintage appeal, they simply won't have the same attraction as potentially an inferior product for more money. In this regard, there is a level of blindness which you do have to avoid. The liking for vintage design doesn't mean that you can simply ignore common sense, where quality and the effort to produce it are concerned. But I mentioned the era in which we live, and I'd like to return to this point, because quite aside from what an utterly abysmal year 2020 has been, and I say that as someone who's had the luxury of being able to see family and go away for a little time on holiday, the modern era is not a golden one for watches in terms of the creation of new watches. It's certainly the most advanced one, yet also one in which the watch means the least. Today, the watch is, and can be seen as indeed it has been for so long, an expression of wealth or design, or to a certain extent even taste. However, it no longer represents an invaluable companion, a bond beyond sentimental attachment. In the past, whether you loved a watch, hated it, or were simply indifferent, if you wore it, it was your tool and something which was useful to you. Consequently, the use of a watch by a certain individual, character, or for a certain exploit was infinitely more evocative and emotive, and the results remain today. Even if a product has radically evolved over the years, a clin d'œil or wink from the past remains, even if that past was nowhere near as rosy as we may want it to have been. By contrast, today the idea of buying a watch simply because it's used by an explorer, racing driver or businessman just isn't as appealing. This might be due to the density of modern product placement, the feeling that modern wearers aren't pushing the edge of the envelope in the same way as previous pioneers, or because, as stated earlier, watches just aren't such an essential necessity. Any or all may be correct, but the result seems difficult to avoid. In a way, you could say that today we have far more important things to do, and the nature of pioneers is quite different. Whereas in the past, a child might revere a Group B rally driver or pioneering aviator for their bravery, attributes which, whilst of course present, are not as easily associated today, today's children may look upon a conservationist, leading innovator, or, dare I say it, pioneering politician with awe. For the watch, these roles are, by nobody's fault, irrelevant and leave a modern dive watch, for example, brilliant though it may be, without the context to justify the purchase, unless you look backwards. Of course, you could turn to product placement as a reason why modern watches might be appealing, and of course one could raise the very valid point that plenty of watches of modern design and conception are regularly seen in film or television shows. Inevitably, some would view this product placement as unhelpful to the brands and not something which will influence style for the future. But then again, the Omega Seamaster 300M in Goldeneye was a paid placement, but still revolutionised the Seamaster and Omega as a brand going from the 90s to the 21st century. Still, in my experience, and I would like to be proven wrong here, so please do leave your comments about it, these watches fall into one of two categories. Either the watch presented is classical itself in design, and therefore isn't exactly pushing modern watch styles away from simply enjoying more old-fashioned, more traditional appearances, or, particularly in the case of sports watches shown in films, the design tends to overtake functionality as, fundamentally, tool watches were designed as tools back when they actually were tools. A good example would be the Hamilton watches worn in Interstellar and The Martian. The Hamilton below zero in The Martian is overly styled to the point of having illegible hands and a cumbersome case, whilst the Pilot Day date in Interstellar is simply a more stylish and less legible version of a 1940s Flieger pilot's watch, so in a way you could say they've moved away from the purest of inspiration. Ultimately, the result seems to me that a classically designed, and I don't mean necessarily overtly vintage-looking watch, is almost invariably going to be the future for most everyday timepieces from most brands. Really, I think all the final proof you need to show this change towards a more classical, vintage style and not necessarily trying to push to the future is seen in the new Omega Speedmaster Professional. Really the final bastion of ordered, sober sense as a luxury watch, but one which is every bit a tool and which doesn't hold on to the glamour which, for instance, a Rolex Submariner tends to. This watch has now incorporated not only a new movement and improved specifications, but vintage touches which actually recreated much of the original late 1960s Speedmaster which first arrived on the moon. What's perhaps most interesting to me is that in spite of saying no to over 50 years of aesthetic development from the 1960s onwards, this watch is no less legible than the previous generation Speedmaster Professional, because the original from the 60s was already about as good as it could get as a functional tool, particularly where the aesthetics were concerned. Of course, the movement could and has moved on. But what do you think of these musings? Am I right in seeing a considerable and inevitable future in the vintage style watches we enjoy so much at the moment? Or do you think I've got it wrong? Whatever your opinion, please let me know your thoughts in the comments section below if you're watching this on YouTube as a video. Of course, if you're listening to this as a podcast on any media player which you might enjoy using, please do follow us to be able to catch all future podcasts. So thank you very much for listening. This is Armon from WatchChronicle.com. Out.